Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to be trying out the new Canson Mi-Teintes Velvet paper and seeing just how it compares to Pastelmat. Now I wanted to draw the same reference photo on both papers so that I could use all of the same techniques and supplies and clearly see if there were any main differences. Now I started with the background using a round soft tool and my PanPastels. And the very first thing here that was obvious is just how much more of the colour saturation and how bold the colours were on the background. Now I am using all of the same PanPastel colours, but the difference here is quite extreme, and it was something that I was really pleased about. When using PanPastels on my Pastelmat, I've never once questioned the colour saturation because it's always been impressive. But on the Canson, it was almost like it was one step further. It was that extra level of depth within that colour that I just wasn't expecting. So from that point of view, the Canson, I definitely preferred the background at this stage. Now one thing that I did notice is when working on the Pastelmat that it was a little easier to blend from one colour to the next. Now that's not necessarily an issue with the Canson paper, it would just mean that potentially more of that pigment is going to need to be applied to get that softness, that outer focus effect that we might want. Now there's going to be many times throughout this background where I'm going to try different blending methods, and I did have to use more of those blending techniques on the Canson paper compared to the Pastelmat. But again, that's not a fault, it's just something that we might potentially need to be aware of. Now as I came back in and added some of my lighter shades, this is where you can see some of that softness on the Pastelmat that is immediately captured. On the Canson paper, this is where I did have to work a little harder to get those edges soft. Now of course this is going to vary depending on how out of focus you'd like your background. If you're wanting something that has a little bit more definition with your lights and your darks or some of your colours, then the Canson paper would be perfect. And of course, if you did want to create that softness, we could just apply more of that PanPastel background and continue to blend with the soft tool. Now when I started working on the darker colours, this is again where the Canson got my vote. The colours on the Canson Velvet paper are far more accurate to what they look like in the pans, and this was definitely a big bonus. You can see on the Pastelmat that the colours do look a bit dull, almost like that paper colour is showing through. Now what I want to be focusing on here is again getting that contrast right, so I'm trying to build up more of my darker values on the Pastelmat, and you can see that it is significantly lighter. Now I think because the Canson paper does have a slightly rougher, more textured surface, it's close to Pastelmat, but I do feel like there's a little difference, that's able to grip that pastel quicker early on. Now I would be able to get the colour saturation and the bold colours in place on the Pastelmat with the PanPastels, but as you can see here I'm having to add darker pastel and a little bit more of those warmer colours as an additional layer. With the Canson it's already in place first of all. Now when it came to blending the PanPastels on the background, I'm able to use my finger on the Pastelmat and able to get that soft blend from one colour to the next. On the Canson, I was struggling with that. I could see more of those harsher start and stop points between the lights and the darks. So as you can see here, I'm having to come back in with a paintbrush and just work on those edges a little more. Now what was really impressive is although I was using quite heavy pressure with that paintbrush, I wasn't lifting or moving any of that pastel on the Canson paper. It really did hold in place. Now the one thing I did do on the Canson paper is I used the colourless blender just to get a little bit more of a soft transition, but it has hidden now a little bit of that colour saturation. It's almost like that got lost. So if you are looking to maintain those bright colours for your background, then maybe this is a bit of trial and error, but at the moment I would use more of that PanPastel pigment and apply more layers to blend rather than use the colourless blender. But again, this was my first experience of using it, so as I say, if that is trial and error, then that is something that I can experiment with the next project. Now midway through the background process, I did decide to add a couple of these grasses or bamboo leaves, and I was really glad that I did because there was a difference between how the pencils gripped to that background and that layer of PanPastel. On the Canson paper, I was feeling like it was on the verge of filling the tooth of the paper. I still had enough just to get this amount of background with the grasses in, but it is something that would be a consideration if you do like using more of your pencils for your backgrounds. Then I had more tooth of the paper left on the Pastelmat version. So at this point here, I loved the Canson Velvet paper, and I was really interested to then see how it worked with the fur and drawing the panda. Now, as always, I do like to start off with the eye, and I'm just using a combination of light and dark pencils here to map in my main highlights and then those darker portions of the eye, purely just mapping in the shape and size. Now this here, I was very impressed. I was able to capture the size of the eye, those subtle soft highlights, with no problem. Now when it came to working with the PanPastel base layer for the fur, the only real difference is I felt like the Pastelmat had a bit more of a smoother layer to it, but because I do cover all of this with my pastel pencils, this isn't something that I think is a negative. But if you do work with your PanPastels for your underlayers and you like to get a little bit more of a thicker coverage, then I think you would end up using a little bit more of your PanPastels here, but it would be marginal. The difference here, the comparison is very similar. Now one of my favourite ways to work is just with the pastel pencils. So here in this next clip, I'm going to show what that layer looks like without the PanPastel stage in first. Now the Canson Velvet paper, as I've mentioned before, I do feel like it has a little bit more of a textured surface. It's close to Pastelmat, but I do feel there's a difference. And here I'm just using a scrap bit of Pastelmat to show that with that initial stage, I felt like the Pastelmat did have a bit more of that smoother, less textured first layer. Here, as I'm working on the Canson, there is just a little bit more of that visible, but again, this isn't anything that would stop me from using this paper. All I did here was just come back in with a second layer and made that a little darker. Now, one thing I do want to mention is at this first stage, I personally like to use just a little bit more pressure. If I was using very light pressure and using the side of the pencil, then I'd get a slightly different result. But for me, I do like using a little bit more of that pressure to get a bit more of a better coverage, and those are the differences that I found here. Now the next test was to see how the Canson paper coped with having some of those mid-tone details, those slightly lighter values, applied on top of such a dark layer of pastel. And again, I was impressed. I did feel like I needed to work with a little bit more of a sharper pencil on the Canson paper, and you can see that here, compared to the Pastelmat. But again, both of those, I was really happy with the subtlety, the way that those values showed up, because that is a very dark layer of pastel. Now, I've not tried to capture any bright highlights here. This section of the black fur was quite dark, so potentially as I experiment with this paper going forward, I'll be able to really test how light I can get those values on dark fur. But for this side-by-side comparison, it was fine. I didn't see any negative effects with the Canson compared to the Pastelmat. Now when I started working on the white sections of the fur, this is where I did start to run into a couple of issues. Now whether or not it's just going to require a slightly different layering process and technique to get this fur as realistic as I would like, that's something that I can continue to experiment with. But starting here, I'm just using my white PanPastel. On the right hand side on the Pastelmat, I'm using a little eye makeup applicator. And on the left Canson side, I just used my round soft tool. Now the softness of that PanPastel layer here on the Canson Velvet is just because I'm using the soft tool. The eye makeup applicators, because they are a smaller sponge, you get a little bit more of that start and stop mark. But in terms of applying the pastel, it was the same. Now it's always my preference to use a thinner layer of PanPastel when I work with the layers of fur, because I am always making sure that I don't want to fill the tooth of the paper. So you can see that the right hand side, there's a little bit more of a darker layer coming through, but that's just because the Pastelmat paper is a little bit darker than the lighter grey shade that I was using of the Canson Velvet. But applying the PanPastel pigment here, it was the same thickness of that layer. I really don't want to be filling the tooth of the paper early on, because that can significantly limit what details can be added on top. Now all of the techniques that I'm using for drawing the white fur are exactly the same as to what I use on the Pastelmat. I'm not changing anything here. The pencils that I'm using, the techniques, the pressure that's applied and so on has been exactly the same. Now, as I continued to build up my base foundation, I like to work with a real soft blended layer first, before I start jumping into my details. Now the Pastelmat, you can see that I'm able to use the side of the pencil and I'm able to blend that layer with that pencil into the existing layers I've already added. On the Canson Velvet, I found that was harder to do because you can still see more of the texture of that paper throughout the layering process. So to get something that looks similar to how I would typically like my base layers to look with that softness and blended effect, I'm just going to come in here with a cotton bud with light pressure and help to push those top darker grey layers into the lighter base. Now when I draw white fur, this is always my preference. I do like working light to dark just to make sure that I don't end up with the fur being too dark at that base. I'm always cautious that I want to be making sure that those lighter pencil details can still show up on top. But I like to work this way just to make sure that I don't end up with a base layer, first of all, that's too dark that I then can't lighten. So this is always my preferred layering process. Now, although I had to put a little bit more extra work and time into blending those layers, that isn't any reason for me not to work with the Canson. But when I did come back in with my lighter pencil details here, the very short fine hairs on the top of the nose, I did find that I struggled to get the same delicate details as what I can get on Pastelmat. Now I think the reason being is because that Canson paper is just a little bit more textured, it was showing more of the grain of the paper through. So the option is to apply a little bit more PanPastel at the layers before and just experiment and see whether or not that enables us to create those very short fine details. This is something that I can plan and work on for the upcoming projects on this paper. Now you'll notice here that I am using two different white pencils, and that was because I was wanting to get those fine lighter details to show up a little bit more. So I'm using a softer leaded pastel pencil on the left. I did feel like it helped, but this is something that I'm going to talk more about in the upcoming clips with the white fur. But really here, other than that, because the Pastelmat does have a little bit more of that smoother finish, I was able to get my white tiny details here more fine on the Pastelmat than what I was able to get on the Canson. Now the one thing that I do want to mention here, there is a lot of detail that I'm adding into this smaller area. So whether or not the Canson paper is going to potentially work a little bit better on a larger scale if working with these very fine details like this, but that is a key difference that I noticed here. I was able to get that level of detail on the Pastelmat that I was starting to struggle with on the Canson. Now, one big bonus of the Canson paper is, from what I can tell online, you can or you will be able to buy it in a roll. So this could potentially really open up how big we can work on these projects, which I know is going to be a massive bonus for so many artists. Now what I was finding here is where I was struggling to get those real fine delicate details, it's almost like the lighter pencil strokes I'm adding on the Canson are just a little bit thicker, so it's almost making my layers underneath appear a bit lighter the more details that I add. But again, this is something that I'm going to really focus on with upcoming projects that I've got planned on this paper. This is the very first time I'm experimenting with it and I really am putting it to the test. Now, of course, it might just be that the Canson paper is going to have a slight adjustment with the techniques that we use in order to get these details to be looking as fine and delicate as that. But this is something that I'm really looking forward to experimenting with upcoming tutorials. Now on to another section where the fur was really dark and I'm building up this soft highlight on the edge of the ear. The techniques that I'm using are exactly the same, and really this was pretty much identical. The way that the pencils overlapped those darker layers, I didn't find that the Canson Velvet struggled at all. So I'm really intrigued to draw an animal that has a darker fur colour, so no white, and just see what this Canson Velvet paper can do, again in comparison with Pastelmat. Because really, up until this point, I've only experienced issues drawing lighter pencil strokes over lighter layers of pastel. Now, obviously, I do like to work with multiple layers. I like to build up my pastel stages gradually. This is something where I need a paper that's going to allow those layers to be added. So Pastelmat, I can layer endlessly. I've never got to the point where I feel like I filled the tooth of the paper. and understanding the limit on Canson and whether or not we do have to adjust how that pastel is going to be applied is something that can only come with practice the more that we draw on this paper. But certainly here, looking at the darker areas, I felt like it coped really well, and there's not one here that I could say I prefer the Canson to the Pastelmat. They both did work pretty similar, but I do prefer how the smoother details look on the Pastelmat compared to the Canson. But as I've mentioned many times before, that could just be that we need to experiment with how much of that pastel is applied and get a little bit more of that thicker layer in place before the details are added. Now, working on another white section of the fur, and I'm starting off with building up my base layer. So here I'm using the PanPastels and my round soft tool, and I am just looking to map in my main lights and darks. Now at this stage, I am not looking to mix the exact colour, that really isn't important, but knowing what I learned earlier on in the other white sections of fur, I have lightened my base layer on the Canson Velvet just a fraction. Now this is because I did have an issue with those lighter pencil strokes showing up on top, so I was a little bit more cautious to make sure that I didn't make some of that section of fur too dark. Now I am still moving that applicator following the direction of the fur, so from that point of view all of those techniques were the same. I want to be making sure that I am mapping in my main lights and darks so that I can get an indication of the way that that fur moves even at that base layer stage. Now once I'd started to build up some of that base layer foundation where I'm working on the softness, which I showed you on the white section between the eyes, here I'm starting to come in with that initial layer of first detail. Now you can really see here, this is where the difference was very obvious. The Pastelmat details were finer, they were more delicate, I was able to get those subtle pencils to show up. On the Canson Velvet, this is where I started to feel like I was being held back by the paper. Now again, whether or not this just means that white fur needs to be approached in a slightly different way, and this is something that I am going to continue to experiment with, but just with this first impression, the fur on the left-hand side ends up looking too soft, almost like the layers are getting mixed in with the layers underneath. Sometimes it felt like the pastel pencils on the Canson Velvet were just scraping over the top rather than actually having that pigment leave the pencil and show up as a separate detail. I'm using all of the same light pressure. You can see how I'm holding the pencil towards the middle and end of that barrel, and this is helping to ensure that I don't end up with too much pressure that could potentially cause a thicker line. Now, despite me using lighter pressure, I am still running into issues with those lighter values not really showing up. I even at one point tried to come in and darken some of the layers in between on the Canson Velvet just to see whether or not I could get that to make my lighter details appear brighter. Now, when I started using the white Carbofellow, you can see on the Canson Velvet it didn't really look like it was showing up at all. I've had to switch over to a charcoal pencil, and although that is a little bit lighter, that pencil should technically go far brighter than what it is here. And although I do use the white charcoal pencil on the Pastelmat version, it is later on in the layering process. I've already been able to establish a lot of my lighter details with my lighter pinks and the white Carbofellow before having to jump into my brightest white value. I always like to build up these stages gradually so that I can enhance the depth, the softness and delicate details that I'm adding. So here, this side by side, this really was my only complaint about the paper. I did find that it struggled for the lighter white pencils to show up on top. Now because of that, the Canson Velvet section here, it's getting a little bit of like a foggy effect, just where all of those lighter pencil details are not as crisp. The layering process here doesn't have the same clarity that the Pastelmat can achieve, and I am using all of the same techniques, light pressure and so on. Now as you can see here, this is where I'm switching over to that lighter pencil, and I'm using lighter pressure on this pencil on the Pastelmat because I can use that to my advantage to get those lighter details to be gradually lighter with each layer that I add. Now on the Canson Velvet, when I was using that white charcoal pencil, I was trying to use a range of pressure, so even increasing the pressure, but it wasn't able to get that detail any lighter. All it did was just make those pencil strokes appear a bit thicker, which obviously is not helping with that softness with the fur texture and the delicate detailing that I needed for this area of the fur. Now, based on how the pastel pencils worked on the Canson Velvet over the darker areas, the real darker areas, I would be intrigued to find out whether or not a darker fur would have any similar issues with those lighter pencil strokes showing up. Now, obviously, I like to add a lot of my details here to capture that extra level of realism, but the layers underneath play a very important role in that. It's helping with the depth and more of that shape and form that gets established through having good contrast. Now, on the left-hand side, because of the issues I'm having, the contrast was starting to get impacted, which does therefore affect how three-dimensional that animal is going to look. Now, one thing I can't stress enough is the Canson Velvet version is still very detailed. It looks realistic. I'm being very picky because I wanted to see whether or not this paper, with the techniques that I like to use on Pastelmat when drawing white fur, can be exactly the same on the Canson. And obviously this is one of the issues that I run into, but whether or not it's just that we need to work in a slightly different way, I can't wait to experiment and find out. Now on to one of the final parts of this project, and again we're back working with the darker fur. Now you can see in the corner there that I've got a palette camera. This is available with all of my real-time tutorials. I'm showing how much PanPastel to apply, how to mix the colours, and how to avoid filling the tooth of the paper at this stage. This is obviously something that is really important because we don't want to ever get to the point where we can't add details on top. Now that will happen if too much pastel is applied at that base layer stage. Now when I worked with building up the layers of subtlety around the edge, this is what's going to help create that softness. So you can see that I don't jump into using my lightest pencils. I always build up those values in stages. And again, when drawing the dark fur, I have no complaints here with the Canson Velvet. It coped really well with those subtle details that I'm adding on top. I do like to work with the subtle layers, so although these details are barely visible, these do help with adding in some softness and extra depth to the fur. So it's always a stage that I like to make sure that I include. The only real difference here with this section is I do feel like the details that overlap the background, they do have more of that grainier appearance to them. So I'm going to try to work on this as I use this paper more, but it is something that I don't experience with the Pastelmat. You can see just how smooth those details are on the Pastelmat compared to the Canson Velvet. Now, one of the very last things that I like to add to my drawings are the details that are sitting in front or overlapping everything else. So in terms of this, they are things like the whiskers and the hairs on the very lower part of the face that overlap the neck. Now I'm using that same white charcoal pencil, and again you can see here that I can add pencil strokes in a couple of different directions to hint at those top layers of detail that I'm not able to really get to the same extent on the Canson Velvet. This is where the main difference is, and I know I've already spoken about this, but I am going to continue to experiment with this area of the layering process on the Canson Velvet and see whether or not I can overcome these issues. So overall, comparing these papers, I do prefer, just with this one experiment, the fine details and the way that the lighter pencils show up on the layers of the pastel on the Pastelmat compared to the Canson Velvet. But the Canson Velvet coped really well with those darker layers. The colour saturation is gorgeous. I absolutely love that. And it is something where, as I've mentioned, the use of those techniques might just have to be adjusted slightly to make the Canson Velvet work in the same way that I like to use the Pastelmat. So here is a photo comparing the two. I really do like the colour and that bold contrast of the background on the Canson Velvet, but without a doubt I did find overlapping those white fine hairs of the Pastelmat that much easier. Now, something that I know can be very irritating when working with Pastelmat is the fact that it can curl up at the edges. Now with the Canson Velvet, like in this photo here shows, it lies completely flat. The backing of that Canson Velvet is lighter. It doesn't have as much of that rigidity to it, which does make the Pastelmat backing make that paper warp at the edges. So if that is something that does bother you, then without a doubt the Canson Velvet would have that vote. That's definitely a big plus side. But in terms of the overall weight of the paper, I feel like Pastelmat has that extra support because it does have that harder, slightly thicker backing. The Canson Velvet is still a very nice weighted paper to work on, but I would recommend if you're walking with that and it's not on a board that you support it at both sides of that paper because it does move a lot more than the Pastelmat. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. I would love to hear your feedback and your thoughts in the comments below. Would you like to see some more additional tutorials on the Canson Velvet? If so, pop any suggestions for subjects, animals that you would like to see featured, and I will get more of those tutorials planned. I'd love to hear if you've used the Canson Velvet as well. How did you find it? Did you prefer it over the Pastelmat? Are there things that you like about it or that you dislike? I would really love to hear your thoughts on that. So if this video was useful, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. The real-time tutorial of this panda is available on my Patreon channel. I am also going to have the real-time step-by-step Pastelmat version there as well. And I've completed all of the voiceovers whilst I'm drawing, so every single process is explained thoroughly in the moment. They're very step-by-step lessons and perfect for following along too. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments below because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week.